time with the kings and how that might relate to us today, how sometimes getting what we want isn't the best thing for us. And so we give you thanks that you walk alongside us in both the good times and the challenging times. We ask that you be with Reagan tonight, bring her healing and wholeness, help her to feel better as we look forward to being able to praise you in song and worship next week. But be with us in our conversations here tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so tonight we're looking at the story of where kings fit in Old Testament stories and why the people wanted a king. So last week we were kind of in the time of the judges, which were different than a king, but the ancient Israelites were tired of getting stomped on. They were looking around and saying, everybody around us has a king. We really need a king too. And so God finally relented and said, kings are bad for you, but if that's really what you want, I guess you can have it.
Enjoying your sandbox? Well, that's just wonderful. Oh dear, it appears that you've just encountered Ted, the local bully. How unfortunate. I imagine that you're wishing you had someone bigger than Ted to protect you, yes? Well, that reminds me of a story. The story of when the Israelites asked God for a king to protect them. You see, the Israelites, a simple tribal people, had been living for quite some time in the land God had promised them. The problem was that they were constantly being invaded by other more powerful nations that were led by a king. The Israelites had no king, so it was difficult not to feel a little inferior to all these other nations and their big, strong, confident, handsome, charismatic, assertive, hygienic kings. Yeah! That, and they were tired of being beaten to a pulp. And so they asked God for a king to represent them and to lead them to greatness. The only problem was that God was already the leader of the Israelites. Not that the Israelites were saying God was doing a bad job. They were just thinking that a human king might expedite all the greatness and protection God had promised them. And so God relented and gave them a king and a warning.
Side effects of having a king may include him taking your children, your fields, vineyards, olive groves, grain, wine, servants, cattle, and donkeys. Consult a prophet immediately if your king exhibits any following behaviors: aggressiveness, agitation, confusion, hallucination, narcissism, adultery, or megalomania. Other more severe side effects may include depression, famine, civil war, exile, enslavement, and nausea.
Hooray! Despite God's rather blunt warnings, the Israelites were thrilled to finally have a king. Unfortunately, everything God warned them about eventually came true. So you see, children, getting your own king, or in your case, getting your own bully, may not be the best. Oh. I see that you've already found your own, muscle. Well, I suppose one can't just stand idly by when you're being terrorized. One has to stand up for oneself, don't they? I suppose this sort of thing was inevitable. Or was it a misstep? Or possibly an inevitable misstep. At this point, one can only speculate.
There we go. All right. So we're looking at trying to cover a lot of ground here with kings, but we're kind of going to focus on the three main ones. So in ancient Israel, there were a total of 42 kings and one queen. And some of the kings were very good. Some of them were not so good, and some of them were downright horrible. So tonight we're going to look at the three kings who the Bible talks about the most and who give us a good idea of why kings could be a good thing, but apart from God's help, they easily could turn into bad kings and bad for the people as well. So the first king that we're looking at tonight is King Saul. Now, how does one go about who is going to be the best leader for the people? How do you choose a good leader? We're going to practice here the way that they decided who should be the first king of Israel. So what I need you to do is come up front here and line up from tallest over here to shortest on this end over here. Okay, so stand up, come stand up front, tallest to shortest. Get yourselves lined up. I think you might have to stand on the ground level to make a line long enough. So stand down here so we got enough line to make one whole line. Come stand on the main floor. Tell the persons next to you, come stand on the main floor so there's enough to make one line. Okay. Clap once if you can hear me. Clap twice if you can hear me. Great. Okay, I need everybody to be on the main floor, otherwise it's going to be really hard to have everybody be a fair measurement here. Okay. Stand next to those around you and get lined up, tallest to shortest. Okay, you might need to spread out on the ends a little bit to make more room in the middle. Okay, I think this is as close as we're going to get to a straight line. We've kind of got a group in the middle here. But so the way that the prophet Samuel chose the first king of ancient Israel, he looked around and he said, oh, Dominic is the tallest, and therefore he is the best candidate to be the next king, for sure. Okay, that was easy, wasn't it? Dominic, you're the new king. All right, you can go take a seat while we hear more about Dominic or Saul's reign. Don't worry, you'll get more chances to be king or queen tonight. All right, so let's hear about King Saul. It says the prophet chose Saul because he was a handsome young man who was easy to find anywhere in Israel because he was a full head taller than anybody else. So it was easy to find because when they looked around, they could say, oh, there's Saul. He's a full head length taller than anybody else. Some studies suggest that even in our country, in presidential candidates, that a slightly taller candidate has a better chance of winning in the election. But what do you think? Does height really determine who would make a good king or leader? What do you think? No, not necessarily. No, even Dominic says no. All right. So initially, Saul, too, was reluctant to be the king, and he didn't really exhibit good leadership skills, except when the nation had its first emergency came up, and he leads a surprise attack on a neighboring nation, one that's been threatening Israel for a while. So remember, kind of like the bullies there? Like the larger bully in the video, King Saul stopped Israel from being picked on and bullied by other nations. So Saul was established as a military leader of the people. He was really good at that. But it didn't take long under his reign for Israel to not only be defending themselves, but to say, hey, we're pretty good at this fighting stuff. Maybe we should take the fight to other people. So with just one victory under their belt, Saul led the Israelites up against the Philistines, who were this great military power at the time. And Saul hadn't really thought out who he was taking them to fight with, because only two people in the whole of the Israelite nation had swords, King Saul and his son. Everybody else, they were all farmers, and so the best thing that they might have had were some sharp sticks, some spears to fight with. The Philistines, they were a well-developed nation. They had armor, they had swords, they had helmets, all that kind of good stuff for fighting. And so they went into that war, and Saul kind of began to lose it, but thanks to his son Jonathan's military tactics, they pulled through. They did win that battle. But it didn't matter how strong or courageous Saul was in battle. He was poor at listening to God, and he was really poor at listening to the people. And so he lost their favor, he lost God's favor, and he lost the prophet Samuel's favor. So Saul was really good at war, but not at listening to God or the fellow Israelites. So before Saul's kingship even comes to an end, it's time for Israel to select a new king, and it's time for us to select a new king. So now what I need you to do, like you did before, this might take just a little bit more time, but I need you to line up oldest to youngest. Okay, so come back up front and line up oldest to youngest.
Is this 14 older?
We could do that. Let's start and say the table. If you're older than 14, go on this side of the table. If you're older than 14, go on this side of the table. Almost 14 is not 14. If you're 14 or older, go on this side of the table. Okay, just kind of squeeze in where you think you need to be at this point. Now, what do you think? If we're lining up from oldest to youngest, what do you think, oldest to youngest, who might be the most experienced, or who might be the best to be the next king? Maybe the oldest one, they would have the most experience? Okay, so second king of ancient Israel, does anybody know who the next king is? David. David is next. So when Samuel goes to the family of Jesse, God has told him, I want you to go see Jesse's kids, and I will tell you which one is going to be the king. So this is what Jesse does. He lines up all of his boys from oldest to youngest. And the prophet Samuel goes, it must be Will. He's the oldest one. Surely this is God's anointed. Yep. And God says, nope. And Samuel keeps going down the line. He goes, well, surely this, nope. Her? Nope. Maybe no, not Brooklyn. Nope. Maybe, no. Samuel keeps going down the line. Keeps going down the line, and and God says, yep, it's this guy. It's this guy.
I told you I was 6.
Except you weren't even in the line, because they were so sure that it couldn't possibly be you that they'd said, you go out and play in the field today because you couldn't possibly be the king. Except they have to say, get back in here, you're going to be the king. This is our new King David, the youngest. All right, go take a seat. Let's hear about King David. Aiden, right? Aiden is King David. Okay, so things went a little bit differently with selecting the next king, right? This time God was more explicit in that he says to Samuel, I'm not concerned with outward appearances. I don't care how tall they are, I don't care how old they are, I don't care how well experienced they are, or how unqualified they are. God says, what I'm interested in is what's going on in here. And David is known for being a king, a man who is after God's own heart. So David, who is the youngest of the family in the eyes of all those around him, likely the least qualified because he's so young, he's the one who's selected to become the next king after Saul. Now, while Saul is still king at this point, so David's been selected to be the next king, but it's not his time yet. Saul is still the king. While David is young, he's already extremely successful in battle with events like maybe this story that you're familiar with, David and Goliath. And because he is so good in war, he becomes very popular with the people of Israel, so much so that King Saul becomes jealous of him. And Saul tries on several occasions to kill David, to have David assassinated, to put David into dangerous situations where he'd likely be killed at war, but each time David escapes or avoids death. Now David, on the other hand, has lots of opportunities to very easily kill King Saul, and yet he doesn't. His supporters, all those around him, encourage him and say, Saul is trying to kill you. You really ought to get him before he gets you. But David, again, is more interested in what God wants than what necessarily might be good for David, because let's say that David did kill Saul. What does that teach the people that he's leading? When you've got a problem with your leader, what do? You kill him off. It's not something that David wanted to teach the people. So King Saul, he ends up being his own worst enemy, and because of distrust between him and the people that he serves, and distrust between him and God, he trusts himself more than God. Saul leads the Israelites into yet another great battle, which they are horribly defeated in, and Saul ends up taking his own life instead of being captured by the enemies. So that's how Saul's kingdom ends. He kind of is this glory hound, and it goes bad for him in war, and he ends up taking his own life instead of being captured by the enemies. Now, with Saul out of the picture, one of the first things that King David does is to unite all the people together and have a big party in the capital, to have this common place for worship. So he takes over the city of Jerusalem, which nobody owns at that time. He takes it over. It's a neutral territory, but it's in the middle of all the 12 tribes of Israel. He takes it over. He uses that city as a central location for government and worship in the kingdom. And there he brings the Ark of the Covenant of God, which the people believe held the presence of God. So he brings that into the city. And as you can see, if you didn't know this story about David already, we're going to hear a little bit about it on Sunday morning. But when David comes into the city, he is celebrating and he is dancing and he is having such a great time praising God. And his clothes are missing. He's dancing in the nude. That's just how much of a good time that he is having. You can kind of see his wife at the time in the upper right-hand corner. She is terribly embarrassed by what he has done and will not talk to him after he's done this thing. But now you know yet one more story about King David and how he likes to celebrate. So he has this big party. Military, politics, religion were all centralized in one place in the city of Jerusalem under King David. It's one of his greatest achievements. He gets the people united. It's what brings the ancient Israelites to the height of their power and influence in the ancient Middle East. So David has this party to celebrate and recognize God at work at the center of the kingdom. He guides the people according to God's will. And David makes this promise. He says, God, you're so awesome, I'm going to build you a house to live in. But God instead makes an important promise to David at this point. God says, I will build a house for you, David. And it won't be a house of wood and bricks, but instead it will be a house of people. And here's his promise to David. He says, always, David, one of your descendants will sit on the throne of God's kingdom, which is really important when we get to the New Testament. When we hear about Jesus, sometimes that's where you hear in the New Testament he's referred to as a son of David. His father, Joseph, in the New Testament, or who goes along with Mary to look after him anyway, his earthly father is of the lineage of David. So important link there for you to remember. So if the most famous story about David is David and Goliath, or now David dancing in the nude for you, then his most infamous story is the story of David and Bathsheba. So things are going great in the kingdom. King David stays home one night because things are going so well. He's trusting the army is off fighting the war. And so he's at home. He's out on a nice evening looking out over the rooftops of the city. He sees a beautiful woman bathing out there. And he calls her to come to his house. He finds out she's already married. And so David uses his power to place her husband, who was in the military, in the middle of the worst fighting. And by way of this, her husband dies, and what do you know? he's suddenly able to marry Bathsheba. So David is corrupted by his power. Uses his power to take Bathsheba into his own house and make her his own wife, and he suspects that nobody's going to do anything about this. Nobody's going to find out about this, and even if they do, I'm King David after all. What could they possibly do to me? But he's forgotten that God is fully aware of what David has been up to. And while God says he will keep his promise that he made to David, because God keeps his promise, as punishment, David and the people of Israel will now constantly have to fight in order to get and keep what came easily to them before when they were following strictly under God's direction. So to add to the wars now that have been going on around them, David, as he gets older, his sons grow up. They can't tolerate the way that dad's leading anymore. They begin to see his corruption, and they even start to fight against him. So while Israel is warring with other nations around them, there's a civil war that breaks out among them, among dad and one of his sons, Absalom, that you can read more about. So they get through that. David ends up, his son gets caught in a tree by his long hair during the war and is hung in a tree and dies that way. So very tragic, but they do get through that civil war. There comes to be a degree of unity and peace again, but it's never going to be the same as when it started, when things were good, when David was first starting and had that great party to celebrate God being at the head of the people. He trusts God's ability to protect them less and less, and so God begins to remove his protection. The people become sick, and they lose their strength, and they lose their numbers, so that they have to rely on God. They can't trust in their own power anymore. But then when David is in his old age, he becomes less and less involved in a war, and again, as he becomes weaker, his kids begin scheming. Dad's going to die soon. Who's going to be the next king? Who is going to take over after King David? So before King David dies, he names his son Solomon to be the next king, the next heir to the throne. David's last words to Solomon were, "Be strong and show yourself a man. Follow the Lord's commandments and walk before him in truth." And David is remembered as the greatest king because even in spite of his flaws and his failures, he led the people to worship and follow only one God, the Lord of Israel. Okay? So, that leads us now to Solomon, the last king that we're going to look at tonight. The last king under the United Kingdom of ancient Israel before it splits into north and south. King Solomon is remembered for, anybody know King Solomon or what he might be remembered for? He wrote Proverbs. Yes, so he wrote Proverbs, he wrote Ecclesiastes. He's the wisest king that ever lived. So when King Solomon has this dream when he's a boy, where God asked him, "King Solomon, what do you want?" And he said, "God, you've already given me such a great people. Grant me the wisdom to lead them." So God's response was to give Solomon the needed wisdom and the additional wealth and glory beyond any king before him, and more wealth and glory than any king after him. So the first thing that Solomon did in all of his wisdom was kill anybody who didn't agree that he should be the next king. Okay? He did have glory and power more so than anybody else, but as we look at his actions, he probably wasn't the wisest. So we need to go back to King David. Where'd my King David go? Okay, King David, you need to select your heir. That's how we're going to do it this time. All right, come on up here. King Solomon, stand up front here. And now, just right there in front of the table, because you need lots of room, because now I need all the ladies in the room to come stand up and stand around you. Girls, come on up and stand around your new king. Okay. This is kind of a portrait picture of what King Solomon was like. Anybody see any problems with this? He was a ladies' man. Well, yes, we could say that about him. But the way that he went about things was a little bit problematic. And can you imagine, could you make all of these ladies happy to be married to you?
Probably not.
Do you think that they might ever get upset that you were giving one more attention than the other?
Most likely.
Okay. You don't really care, but you'd still be happy to be married to him and have him be married to all these other ladies too.
I don't want to be married right
Well, you don't have a choice, because King Solomon said, you're my wife now. That's kind of how it would go. Okay, go take a seat and you can contemplate all of the challenge of this. King Solomon, thank you. Go have a seat. All right, so that was one of the first things that King Solomon did in all of his wisdom, was in order to build good relationships with foreign kingdoms, he went and married wives from all their nations. So, because, right, they couldn't come and attack because their daughter was married to the king and they'd be attacking their own daughter. So that was in his wisdom. One of the first things that he did was to marry many wives of other nations. Now, to make it easier, to make it more convincing for them to say, okay, sure, we'll come be your wife and live in the palace, he told them, you can bring your faith along with you. Whatever you believe in, go ahead, bring that along with you, and you can worship in the temple. So it'd be like if we were to say, we don't care what your faith is, if you are of the Muslim tradition or you're the Buddhist tradition, whatever it is, we don't care, bring it in, come and worship on Sunday mornings here as we worship God on Sunday mornings. So that's kind of what King Solomon did. He said, you can, whatever you got, bring it in, come and worship it here. Okay? It did strengthen the relationship with foreign nations, but it also strengthened the relationship with foreign gods, which was exactly what King David told him. There's only one. There's only one God. So under Solomon, though, in all his power and glory, one of the things he did accomplish was to build this elaborate, and come on, oh, we're going backwards here. There we go. He built the most ornate and elaborate temple. It was constructed and adorned with the finest wood, gold, and silver, all kinds of jewels. But in order to build such a temple, Solomon had to continually raise taxes and even resorted to slave labor. Slave labor. A slave labor force of over nearly 100,000 people. So when Solomon died, he had introduced so many foreign practices and foreign gods into the culture of ancient Israel that there was this great power struggle after he died, as if to say, are we going to go back to the way that David did things? Do we follow the way that Solomon did things? And so that's what leads to the split between northern and southern kingdom, because Solomon had gone so far off track that they couldn't agree how they were going to go forward. All right, so we're getting close to your question for the night. So there you've got it. We had many kings, one queen who came after Saul, David, and Solomon, but none whose impact was greater or recorded in such detail as the three we just heard about now. A handful of them were good, a bulk of them were bad, and some of them were downright terrible, with doing things like telling the people, you need to bring your child to the altar and sacrifice it. That was one of the practices that were introduced under the kings after Solomon. When the people first asked to have a king, like the foreign nations around them, God warned them. God said, these kings, these will be the way that things are when you have a king. He will take your sons and send them off to war. He will take your daughters and appoint them as his wives to cook for him and to make him happy. He will use the rest of your family to take care of his own fields. He will take your best food and possessions for himself and give whatever is left to his friends. He will take your servants and the best of your livestock for himself, and even you shall become his slave. Does that begin to describe some of the things that you heard about these three kings doing tonight, and much more so the ones after them? So, the big question you're taking on in your small groups tonight: why would God allow us to do or have things that could lead us towards trouble? All right, go ahead, break out into your groups. That's your question you're tackling tonight. Where do you guys meet? Where? In the cry room? Okay, I'll be there in just a little bit.